So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the May Max Weber lecture. And we're very thrilled to have Gabriel Zucman from the Paris School of Economics and University of California at Berkeley to tell about tax evasion. I'm going to hand it over to Ken, who is chairing, Ken Stiller, who is going to be chairing this lecture, and he's going to give a bit of a more comprehensive introduction to this evening's speaker. So please, Ken.
Thank you, Juho. Hi, everyone. Welcome to May's Max Weber lecture. Our speaker today will be Gabriel Zucman. Gabriel is a professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics and the École Normale Supérieure, and an associate professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. He further is a co-director of the World Inequality Lab and founding director of the EU Tax Observatory. Gabriel's research focuses on the accumulation, distribution, and taxation of global wealth, as well as tax competition. In a series of papers and in his book, The Hidden Wealth of Nations, which has been translated into several languages, he has developed methods to measure the wealth held in tax havens. In recognition of his work, Gabriel received last year's John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association for his contribution to the field of public economics, and particularly his research on the relevance of tax evasion, showing that tax evasion is more important than previously assumed in the discipline. Before that, Gabriel was named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow in 2021. He was awarded the Bernather Prize and a Sloan Research Fellowship in 2019, the Best Young French Economist Prize awarded by Le Monde and Le Cercle des Économistes in 2018, and the Excellent Award in Global Economic Affairs from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy in 2017. Beyond academia, Gabriel's work addresses both policymakers and the general public. Web tools such as the World Inequality Database and realtimeinequality.org make data on inequality accessible for non-expert audiences and the general public. The first edition of the Global Tax Evasion Report, which Gabriel will be speaking about today, was coordinated and published by the EU Tax Observatory and reflects an unprecedented research collaboration on tax evasion and policies designed to curb said tax evasion. So I think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone when I say it's really a pleasure to have you here, Gabriel, and we're all looking forward to your presentation. So please do join me in welcoming Gabriel.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. And what an impressive room and what an impressive audience. So I'm very much looking forward to this presentation, and more importantly to the conversation and to all your questions after the lecture. So a few years ago, more precisely in 2021, I created the EU Tax Observatory, which we are currently transforming into a truly global tax observatory. And the goal of this research lab is to conduct research on tax avoidance, tax evasion, the interplay between this evasion and the dynamics of inequality, the consequences of international tax competition, and more importantly, the solutions that can be addressed to these problems. And so this work that I'm going to present today is indeed our inaugural tax evasion report, where we try to address a simple question, which is the following. Over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a number of policies that have been implemented to try to curb international tax evasion. So for instance, some of you might know that since the beginning of this year, 2024, a number of countries implement a minimum tax, a coordinated minimum tax of 15% on multinational companies. More than 140 countries have agreed to implement such a minimum tax. There have been other policies like that I'm going to present in a second. And what we wanted to do in that report is basically to ask, okay, what's the reality of the progress that's been achieved in fighting tax evasion over the last decade, and what remains to be done. Okay, so sometimes you hear policymakers who make grandiose proclamations such as, oh, it's the end of tax havens, or, we've solved, the problem of tax competition, or things like that. And so what we're trying to bring to that debate is a more data-based approach, trying to summarize the work that's been conducted to evaluate those policies. And a lot of this work, some of that work is done by researchers that are affiliated to our observatory. We have about 25 people in our research group, but a lot is also done by people who are not in the observatory, and we're trying to summarize all of that body of work. When I started my PhD 15 years ago, this field of study of offshore wealth, profit shifting by multinational companies, and so on, was not very much researched, by economists. There was some work, and important and interesting work by people in the other social sciences, in political science, in sociology, or by non-profit organizations, but there was relatively little work in economics. And today the situation is really very different, and I feel fortunate to be part of a growing community of scholars. We counted more than 100 researchers who are active today in that field of research. Okay, so we try to summarize this work in the report. The report is coordinated by my colleagues Annette Atatsater, Sarah Godard, Panos Nicolaides. We had a very kind foreword by Joe Stiglitz. And the report is also supplemented by a new database where you can download not all, but most of the data that we use in the report. The database is called the Atlas of the Offshore World, and it provides up-to-date series of the amount of wealth that's held in tax havens by the residents of the different countries, or the amount of profits that's shifted by multinational companies to tax havens, and other statistics. Okay, so before presenting the results, let me take perhaps one step back and ask the following question. Why do we need a global tax evasion report? And in particular, why is it important to take a global perspective on these issues? And I think the reason is this. If you take a purely national perspective on taxation, this can generate misleading conclusions, in my view. So in particular, if you take a purely national perspective on tax policy, from a national perspective, it can pay off to play the game of tax competition or to become a tax haven. And all the countries, are doing this. I'm not, pointing fingers at one country or another. With globalization, essentially all countries have become small relative to the world as a whole, and have been tempted to offer subsidies for certain companies, for certain type of economic activity, or financial opacity services, and so on and so on. And it can pay off in the sense that by doing that, you can attract activity in your country, or you can attract profits, you can grow the tax base, you can collect more tax revenue, you can attract financial assets. But what's very important to understand is that from a global perspective, essentially all of that is zero sum, because the activity that's attracted by country A, it's attracted from another country. So it doesn't increase the global level of economic activity or the global capital stock. And in fact, worse than that, it's often negative sum from a global perspective, because those processes of tax competition, of financial opacity, and so on, at the end of the day, they primarily benefit relatively wealthy individuals the owners of multinational companies or the people who can hide assets in tax havens. And so it tends to fuel inequality. Okay, so to summarize, if you take a purely national perspective, you're going to conclude that certain policies are great. Look, it works for us. It increases tax revenues. Fantastic. But, if you take a global perspective, you can reach the opposite conclusion. It fuels global inequality without boosting global economic activity. So that's why this global perspective is so important. And more fundamentally, what we need for taxation is perhaps the equivalent of the IPCC, but for taxation. So you all know the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that tries to take a global perspective on global warming and policies that are implemented to try to prevent it. And essentially, I think there's a good case that we should, hope to have something like that for taxation, taking a global perspective on the sustainability or sometimes the lack of sustainability of our tax policies. At a very, very modest level, with our EU, soon Global Tax Observatory, we're trying to planting the seeds for what ultimately, in the future, and again, I stress, that this is at a very modest level, but what ultimately could become an IPCC for taxation. Okay, so that being said, let me now dive into the results. And the results, if I want to summarize the main results, I would say that it's like in the famous movie that you all know, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Okay, so I'm going to start with the good news. The good news is that we've made some progress, in fact, quite a lot of progress in reducing one specific form of tax evasion, which is the concealment of wealth in offshore tax havens. So let me unpack that a little bit. Here's a chart that shows, so on the x-axis you have time, on the y-axis you have the amount of wealth which is held globally by households outside of their country of residency in countries with traditionally very strict bank secrecy rules. So places like Switzerland or like Luxembourg or like the Cayman Islands or Singapore and so on. Okay, so this offshore wealth, and here it only includes financial wealth. So think of bank deposits or portfolios of equities and bonds and mutual fund shares that households own in offshore banks. This offshore wealth is quite large. Globally, it adds up to about 10, 12% of global GDP. That's the blue line. And that has remained quite constant as far as we can see, with the methods that exist to measure that wealth. That has remained relatively constant over the last couple of decades. Until the middle of the last decade, the 2010s, it was really easy to hide that wealth and to evade taxation on the income generated by that wealth. So this wealth generates interest, dividends, capital gains, when, for a very long time, there was no exchange of information between banks in tax havens and other countries' tax authorities. So it was really easy for people to hide assets and to fail to report the income that they were supposed to report in their home country. So that's the orange line. The orange line shows that essentially, until relatively recently, the vast majority, almost 90% of offshore wealth evaded taxation. Okay, but then something very important happened, something really fundamental. Starting in 2016 and especially 2017, more than 100 countries have started to exchange bank information on an automatic basis. And that includes essentially all the world's tax havens. So now, if you have a bank account in Switzerland, I'm sure many of you have one or several, then the Swiss banks must automatically inform the tax authority of your country of residency about that account, how much wealth is in there, the amount of income that you earn each year in that account, and so on. Okay, so that's really a dramatic departure from the bank secrecy that had prevailed before for many decades, for more than for a century, essentially. And so we can see that according to the data that we have, this has led to a pretty dramatic decline in the amount of untaxed offshore wealth. Okay, so a couple of remarks about that. First, those estimates are our attempt at summarizing the emerging body of work that studies this policy and its effects. But I must stress that there's quite a lot of uncertainty because we are still at the very beginning of being able to use this data from the automatic exchange of bank information. So, we present a number of scenarios in the report, but you have to be careful and to acknowledge that really there is still considerable uncertainty, in particular because governments publish surprisingly little data about this new data sharing system. Okay. That being said, it's pretty clear from the different studies that exist that the automatic exchange of bank information has been a game changer. We know from statistics collected by the OECD, for instance, that in 2022, there was $11 trillion of wealth that was reported by banks, primarily in tax havens, to other countries' tax authorities, wealth that was completely invisible just before that. Okay, so that's the first remark. The second and more important remark is that I think the reason why this policy is important is because it illustrates a very important idea, which is that tax evasion is not a law of nature. Okay, tax evasion is largely a policy choice. We can choose to tolerate tax evasion, and we've chosen collectively. It's not like it's a choice that was really very much discussed or very transparently or very democratically discussed, but it was a choice nonetheless. We've chosen for a long time not to do anything about that form of tax evasion, and for many years, and I remember when, that's what policymakers used to say when I started researching those issues 15 years ago. Policymakers used to say, look, we can't do anything, right? If some countries want to have very strict bank secrecy rules, we're just powerless. And so it's a kind of law of nature that there will always be wealth concealment and tax evasion in a globalized world. But we now know that this is just not true. Just like we can choose to tolerate tax evasion, we can also choose collectively to create transparency and coordinated policies that can make a real difference. And the third remark is, in turn, this matters, this fact that tax evasion is not a law of nature, but a policy choice. It matters because the point of this is not to say, look, we've solved all the problems, there's no tax evasion anymore in the world, and we're just living in the best of all possible worlds. That's not true. We'll get to the bad and to the ugly in a second. So obviously many problems remain, but it's important because it shows that, in fact, we can be hopeful about the possibility of additional progress, and it's possible to address the very big issues that remain. Okay, so that was the good. But now we must turn to the bad. The bad points to the lack of progress in fighting another form of tax evasion, which is the shifting of profits by multinational companies to tax havens. Okay, so on that chart, there is a simple statistic, which is the global loss of corporate tax revenue, which is caused by profit shifting to tax havens each year, as a fraction of the amount of corporate tax revenue that's collected globally by all governments. So what is profit shifting by tax havens? They hate it when I do that, but let me take the example of Google, Alphabet, one of the biggest company on the planet. In 2003, just a few weeks before being listed as a public company in New York, Google sold some of its intellectual property, some of its search and advertisement technology to a subsidiary that it had just created in Bermuda. Okay? And from 2003 to 2019, this Bermuda subsidiary has made hundreds of billions, and that's with a B, hundreds of billions in revenue and dozens of billions in profit, booked in Bermuda, where the corporate tax rate is a relatively modest tax rate of 0%. So that's profit shifting to tax havens, and Google has done it for a very long time. Many companies do it. Sometimes there's the notion that it's something that only happens or happens to a greater extent in the tech industry. That's not quite true. As far as we can see in the data, this phenomenon is really an across-the-board phenomenon. You also see in the pharmaceutical sector, in finance, in manufacturing, pretty much in all sectors of the economy. The point of the graph is that this form of tax evasion has increased quite dramatically over the last decade. It was essentially negligible until the late 1990s. Then it grew very fast, starting with the beginning of the 21st century. And then it has stabilized at a high level with a loss of tax revenue that's equivalent to 10% of global corporate tax revenues. And that's despite the fact that policymakers have been trying to curb that form of tax evasion. There's been a number of important initiatives. In 2015, the OECD launched the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Initiative. In 2018, the US passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which contains a number of provisions to curb profit shifting by US multinational companies. But as the chart shows, following those policies, it's not that this profit shifting has declined. Now, doesn't mean that those policies obviously had no impact, right? Perhaps absent those policies, the line would have kept growing, and perhaps we can interpret the stabilization as reflecting some effect of those policies. But what we can conclude is that clearly they have not been sufficient to reduce the size of profit shifting to tax havens. Now, there was very high hope, and I was personally very excited in 2021 when more than 140 countries agreed on a minimum tax rate of 15% for multinational companies. And it's true that it's really a landmark in the regulation of globalization, because it's the first time ever that countries agree on a common minimum tax rate. So we have all sorts of international agreements about lots of things, free international trade, for instance, but none of these agreements say anything about tax rates. We have agreements about taxation, but that are limited to just the definition of the tax base, how countries should define and compute profits. But until this 2021 agreement, nothing on minimum tax rates. So a very important development. Early on, in 2020, at the beginning of the new administration in the US, the Biden administration was particularly kind of active on this issue and pushed for a 21% minimum tax rate. That was actually in Biden's presidential campaign program. And 20% or 20% minimum tax rate would really make a big difference. What the chart shows here is that it would increase global corporate tax revenues by about 16.7%. That's the blue line. So that was kind of the hope that was kind of the hope in 2020, early 2021. Then, unfortunately, and for reasons that that I'll get back to later on. Quickly, the rate was reduced to 15%, which is, less than 20%, but still something. It would still, if there was a well-enforced, comprehensive 15% minimum tax, it would still increase global corporate tax revenues by 9%. Okay, so still significant. What has happened since then, since 2021, however, is that the agreement has been weakened by a number of exemptions and loopholes. And I'm not going to go through all of them. Maybe I'm just going to discuss one because it's the one that's not necessarily the most problematic quantitatively speaking, but certainly the one that's most problematic conceptually speaking, which is what is written here, what is denoted as the carve out for substance. So it's a tiny bit technical, but not very technical, and it's really important at a fundamental level. In the agreement, there is a provision that says that, look, if a company has real activity in a country, then it's allowed to exclude a certain amount of profit from the base of the minimum tax. And there is a formula. So for instance, in the first year of the agreement, the formula is 10% of payroll plus 8% of assets. So you compute, let's say a company has some activity in Ireland, you compute 10% of the wages that it pays to Irish workers plus 8% of the value of the assets that it owns in Ireland. And that amount of profit is carved out from the base of the minimum tax, meaning it's not subject to the 15% minimum tax rate. A lower rate can be applied, even 0% is okay. And it's pretty obvious from that this creates perverse incentives. The incentive that this creates is that it encourages firms to move production, to move assets, to move employment to very low tax countries if they want to be able to keep paying less than 15% in taxes. In other words, it risks fueling tax competition, real tax competition, not paper profits moving to Bermuda like Google used to do, but a more harmful, in fact, form of tax competition, which is real activity moving to very low tax places. Okay, so that's one issue. There are other issues, but the bottom line is that when you take into account all these minute details, the revenues that we can estimate from this global minimum tax are only about, an increase of about 4.8% of global corporate tax revenue. So very far, sadly, from what we could expect a few years ago. So that's a serious disappointment. But now we must turn to the good, the bad, and now the ugly. The ugly is the fact that we've not started yet, although that might be changing as we speak, but until at least very, very recently, we've not started to address what's probably the biggest problem in our tax systems, which is that they fail to tax super rich individuals. So here's a chart that illustrates that in 3 countries, the US, Netherlands, and France. So now there's a growing body of work that tries to estimate the progressivity of the tax system following harmonized methods and concepts. In particular, distributing all taxes, absolutely all taxes, VAT, income tax, corporate taxes, etc., payroll taxes, to the entire population, including the super rich. So on the x-axis, P010 is the 10% of people with the lowest incomes, P1020 is the next decile, and so on. And you see on the right-hand side, you have a zoom on the very rich all the way up to dollar billionaires. And on the y-axis, you have the amount of tax that they pay in total relative to their income, so their effective tax rate. Okay, so let's take the case of France. France, as you know, is a high tax country, right? Overall, the ratio of taxes to national income is about 50%. So unsurprisingly, all the socioeconomic groups pay a lot of tax, 45, 50, 55% of their income in taxes. That has to be the case, right? Because the government collects so much taxes in total. With just one big exception, which is billionaires who have an effective tax rate of only 25%, only half of what all other income groups pay in taxes. That's the most extreme case. But you also see similar regressivity in the Netherlands that starts lower actually in the income distribution, that starts already at the 99th percentile, whereas in France, it's really a problem that's focused, that's visible at the very, very top. You have that problem to some extent in the US. There is a recent study that we didn't have the time to include in the report, but which is very interesting about Italy. And in the case of Italy, the curve is very similar to that of France, with also some regressivity that starts below, the very top group, but very, high levels of taxation throughout, falling to about 20% for billionaires. Now, of course, we should, there is a debate to be had, and that's one of the most important debates in democracies about the proper level of progressivity, right? And it's easy to overshoot, but I think very few people are okay with a system like that, where the individuals with the highest ability to pay taxes end up paying much less than everybody else. Okay, and so the question is, how is that possible? And what's going wrong? Well, how is that possible? It's because of the failure of the income tax, the individual income tax, at taxing the super rich. And why does the income tax fail? It's because when you're really rich, it's easy to structure your wealth such that this wealth is going to generate very little or sometimes zero taxable income. So a few years ago, for instance, there were revelations by the US media ProPublica about the taxes paid by US billionaires, based on leaked tax data. And so you saw people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, regularly paying very little or sometimes zero income tax. In some year, for instance, Jeff Bezos reports no income. He didn't pay himself a wage as CEO of Amazon. Amazon didn't distribute dividends. He didn't sell his shares. He reports no income, and he says, look, I'm so poor that I'm going to claim family benefits, which are capped in the US at a low level of income. And he receives family benefits, poor Jeff Bezos, the richest person in the world at the time. And so these are really striking illustrations of that problem. But what that body, of work shows is that the problem goes beyond just a few striking cases like that, and is more general than that. Okay, so that was the ugly. So this leads me to the main proposal that we formulated in the report, which was to try to address this ugly problem. And basically, the idea here is very simple, is to say what we've been able to achieve with multinational companies, agreeing on a common minimum tax rate we should be able to do the same for super rich individuals. The problem is the same. Some of them get away with very, very little tax. And it's always easier to address those issues through international coordination. Okay, so let's consider very concretely a common minimum tax on global billionaires equal to 2% of their wealth. So I want to make sure that everybody understands the proposal. The proposal is that each billionaire should pay each year in individual income taxes, 2% the equivalent of at least 2% of their wealth. Okay, so if you take someone who has $100 billion in wealth and pays more than 2 billion in income tax, then nothing would change for that person. Okay, because he or she is already paying more than 2% of their wealth in tax. But if someone owns $100 billion and pays zero income tax, then that person would have to pay an extra income tax of 2 billion to arrive at a minimum rate of 2%. Okay, so think of that as a top up to the income tax to ensure a certain minimum amount of income tax payments. And that minimum has to be expressed as a fraction of wealth, because if you compute the minimum as a fraction of income, it doesn't work. Remember the example of Bezos. If we had a minimum tax of 25% on income, then he would say, oh, look, my income is zero, so 25% of zero is zero, so I have to pay zero. So we've not solved the problem. That's why it's important that the minimum be expressed as a fraction of wealth. Okay? Now, I want to be very clear that this is a really, modest proposal, right? It's not going to fix capitalism. It's not even going to reduce wealth inequality. Just to understand, for everybody to have the numbers in mind. Since the middle of the 1990s, billionaire wealth globally has been growing at a rate of 7 to 8% a year on average, net of inflation. Okay? If there was a tax of 2%, instead of kind of mechanically, instead of growing 7, 8% a year, their wealth would grow only 5 to 6% a year. Since the middle of the 1990s, average wealth per adult has increased, has grown at a rate of 2.5% a year only. Okay, so you can see that with a minimum tax like that, you're not reducing global wealth inequality, you're just slowing the pace of the increase in global wealth inequality. Okay, so this is really not a radical proposal. It's a minimum tax. It's kind of really a minimum floor, just saying that, zero tax payments is not okay, or very low tax payments is not okay. There should be some floor. Now, it turns out that this floor, even though the rate is low, even though the population involved is really small, we are talking about less than 3,000 individuals globally, that tax could generate quite a lot of revenues. If it had been in place in 2023, it would have generated about more than $200 billion in tax revenue globally. And the reason for that is it's quite simple. It's because although billionaires are very few in number, that's the first column, they own a lot of wealth, about $13 trillion, that's the second column. They pay very little tax as far as we can see, that's the third column. So that adding this moderate top up, generates large sums. And now you might say, okay, well, is that really a lot of money, $214 billion? What does it mean concretely? And I think an insightful comparison is to compare that number with the best estimates that we have about the revenue needs to fight climate change. So according to those numbers, developing countries need an additional $500 billion in tax revenues each year to face the challenges of climate change. Okay? And so what we explain in the report is that you can get there with two modest global minimum taxes. First, the one on billionaires that I just mentioned can generate about half of that. And second, if you strengthen a little bit the minimum tax on multinational firms, increase the rate from 15 to 20%, close the loopholes that I mentioned, you can get an extra $250 billion. Okay? Now, it turns out that this is perhaps not completely a pipe dream for a couple of reasons. The most important reason is that it turns out that Brazil has the presidency of the G20 this year and is very keen on making progress on these issues. And in particular, has put the idea earlier this year of a coordinated minimum tax on billionaires on the agenda of the G20. So I was, I went to one of these meetings. I discovered that these, our finance ministers, that they spend a lot of time meeting, all over the world, at the G20, G7. I don't know how they get any work done because they spend their lives doing such meetings. But in any case, I went to one of those meetings at the end of February in São Paulo to give a presentation and to say, look, building on the successes of the last decade, in particular, the minimum tax on multinationals, let's try to replicate that for billionaires. And a number of countries are very supportive and have already come on board. Brazil is one, France, Spain, South Africa, and others hopefully soon. I was there when the different ministers also commented on the proposal, and so some of them were strongly supportive. Others said, okay, good, it's good that we have that conversation, but we want to learn more about the details. And so I'm working now on a report for the G20 to flesh out the details of such a tax. The US Treasury Secretary said, look, that proposal makes sense, to me, because it turns out that in the budget of President Biden, there is also what he calls a billionaire income tax, which is very close in spirit, at least, to what I propose. It's not exactly the same in the sense that it's not defined relative to wealth, but it's defined relative to a very broad notion of income, but the reasoning is very, very similar. And interestingly, the fact that this is now kind of put in the budget of Biden shows the evolution that has happened over the last few years on this topic, very fast and important evolution. In 2019, 2020, during the previous presidential election in the US, Biden, in the Democratic primaries, campaigned against proposals for wealth taxation that were defended at the time by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. And then once he was elected, he put in his own budget something that was not in his platform as candidate, this billionaire income tax, which is very close to a wealth tax. And, it doesn't have a majority in Congress to pass that. But the fact that he's changed his mind so quickly, I think, illustrates that there is real political momentum around these issues. And, it's not very surprising that there is such momentum. You look at opinion polls all over the world, and you see that it's like 70, 80% of people who are in favor of such policies, and that's across party lines. That's one of these rare areas of economic policy where, almost not everybody, there is overwhelming support for reforms of this type. Okay, so let me just discuss this before concluding. I'm how to say that. I'm an internationalist in my heart. I do think that international coordination, cooperation is really of the essence to make progress on those issues. That being said, there is also a lot that can be done by countries acting unilaterally. And in fact, if you want to make real progress internationally, you need some countries to be bold and to lead the way. And in fact, unilateral action, sometimes, a bit aggressive, can be really necessary to foster international coordination. So let me just mention, let me just illustrate that and then perhaps give one illustration of what countries can do on their own. So getting back to the automatic exchange of bank information, the good in my little story, how did we get to that? How did we get to that new form of international cooperation? Well, essentially it's because in 2009, the US, under Obama, threatened Swiss banks with economic sanctions if they refused to cooperate with the US tax authority with very concrete sanctions, and penalties for payments that would be made to those banks if they refuse to share data with the US. And under the threat of those sanctions, Swiss bankers agreed to disclose information to the IRS. And then other countries said, oh, look, you've been telling us for decades that bank secrecy prevented you from disclosing anything. Now you're sending all your data to the US. So why don't you also send us your data? And that's how this, a bit aggressive unilateral action by the US paved the way for a new form of international coordination. Okay, so that was just to illustrate that idea. Now, what countries can do very concretely unilaterally? Let me just take one example. I'm not going to go through all of these things, but just one important idea. In the debate about taxing the rich, for those of you who follow those debates, there's always at the end of the day one argument that often carries the day, which is, oh, look, we can't do it because let's say if Italy, start taxing our billionaires, what's going to happen is they're just going to move out of the country. Okay? Now, what's very important to understand is that there are actually solutions, unilateral solutions to that problem. What are those solutions? Well, Italy could say this. Italy could say, okay, sure, you're free to move, right? But we will keep taxing you after you've left for a number of years. We can discuss, 5, 10, 15 years. And the logic is obvious. If you've become a billionaire in Italy, that's at least in part because you've benefited from education and healthcare and infrastructure, and your businesses have benefited from all that public spending. And so there is just no natural right to move, once you've become super rich and have nothing to pay. And so countries could say, if you've lived in a country for a long time and you've become very rich in that country, and now you move to a tax haven, then we will keep taxing you after you've moved. We don't need an international agreement to do that. That's a choice that we're not making. The choice that we're making at the moment is, if someone moves, starting January 1st of next year, they have nothing to pay anymore to Italy. That's one choice. We can make another choice, which is the one I just discussed. All right, let me conclude by saying, most important thing, tax evasion is not a law of nature. It's a policy choice. Some policies have been effective in the past, the automatic exchange of bank information. Others are falling short. The ideal is international coordination, but a lot can be achieved unilaterally. And that type of unilateral action that I just described is really key to change the dynamics of global tax competition, which in the end is essential if we want to be able to reconcile globalization, European and global economic integration on the one hand, with tax justice on the other hand. Thank you very much.